Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first podcast edition of Talking Scotland. This is brought to you by Aberdeen Independence Movement and The National. And this is a new monthly podcast focusing on politics in and around the Northeast, the Highlands and Islands, and the borders. So we're climbing out of the Central Belt for a bit. It's what people have been asking for. And we thought we'd have some discussion in regards to those specific areas that affect rural, coastal, and our island communities. So, I am Karen Adam MSP, and I'm your host for this evening. And I'd firstly like to introduce you to my esteemed guests. And firstly, I would like to introduce Kate Forbes, MSP.
Hello, good evening. Delighted to join you from a very snowy, cold Dingwall. But I'm the MSP for Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch, which basically stretches from coast to coast, so representing the East Coast and the West Coast.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate. And my next guest is Councillor Louise McAllister.
Hi. Thanks so much, Karen, for the invitation to come along this evening. I'm really pleased to be here. So I'm a local councillor for Ellen and District Ward in Aberdeenshire, and we have coastline and we have rural land all around us, as well as lots of small villages and towns as well in our local district. So thank you for having me.
Oh, welcome, both of you. And I should actually tell people I am the MSP for Banffshire and Bucking Coast, which is in the top northeast corner and, of course, a coastal and rural constituency. So it's great to be having these kinds of discussions. I was thinking the topic for the first podcast, it would be great to have a discussion around local government. It's been a bit of a hot topic lately, and I just think it would be great if we could open the discussion. It's been about 30 years since there's been any kind of major reform within local democracy. And I would just like to ask, do you think it's time to start having that serious debate on this? And if so, how do we start going about that? I'll come to you, Kate.
Well, yes is the short answer. If I think back to how I first got involved with the independence movement, involved with the SNP, it was really from the angle of being a localist. By that I meant, as somebody from the Highlands, we were always, all of us, it cut across all political party allegiance, it cut across all communities, it cut across, the entirety of the Highlands, the sense of being disenfranchised and being far from power and having things done to us rather than being part of the conversation. And so really this is a question of how we ensure that our people are empowered as much as possible. And that's where the conversation, I think, about local government comes in. And we may get onto this, and this is where I'd be really, really keen to hear others' views, particularly the views of councillors. But at the end of the day, I think that for as long as people feel disenfranchised and far from power, there's reform that's needed. And we talk about local government reform, but it's not just about the structures, it's not just about the funding. It's actually about where power rests, the form that community councils take, what true community empowerment looks like. And I don't think you can divorce issues of land reform from the issues of local government and localism and local power. Because ultimately we know that when people are truly empowered and truly in control of local assets, local land, and so on, that is when they are able to change things. So I think that this conversation is about more than just where, for example, should the headquarters be for Highland Council. And there'll be many in my constituency that argue it shouldn't be in Inverness. But beyond that, I think it opens up much bigger questions about reform that includes what kind of taxation we have, how we fund local services, who makes these decisions. And at the end of the day, if you go and speak to somebody in Knoydart and ask them, do you feel empowered and enfranchised, they should be able to say yes. And until they can say yes, we need reform.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think the point you're making there in regards to this is a lot wider. The scope of this goes further and deeper than what we might first imagine when we think about local government reform, as bearing it down to as simple as, a power here or a power there. What does it actually mean for the people on the ground? And as you say, do you feel that power and control over your own communities? I think it's a really, interesting route to go down and investigate further. Louise, come to you.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree with so much of what Kate has just said. I mean, interestingly, I was one of the people who was in the community council for many years before I was approached, as we often are, to consider standing in election. That was back in 2020. It seems like a lifetime ago already, but fairly recently. So, I've always been involved in our community at a local level, and I think that is hugely important. And one of the phrases that Kate has used is that we want to have things done with us rather than to us. And I know that even here within Aberdeenshire Council, it's a bit of a mantra, because we keep having to bring it back to how essential it is that people do feel involved and they do feel empowered, and that they do have choice and really do have options. And so when we go out, for example, to things like consultation, even on a local level, that consultation has to be meaningful. And I think that when we're looking at reform and how we would go about that, one of the things that comes to me all the time from constituents is that they want consultation to be meaningful. And I think it's quite telling that often people will say, well, the decision's already been made, hasn't it? And unfortunately, sometimes, those decisions are pretty far down the track before that consultation process is there. So I think any kind of discussion about reform needs to be very open, and we need to involve as wide a range of people in our communities as we possibly can. Again, it's one of those things, if we're looking at reform, very often we have the same people who come forward and respond to all our surveys, these kind of things. So it would have to be so wide ranging. And thinking about where Kate is based, where she covers geographically, and yourself as well, Karen, in Aberdeenshire, East Coast is very different from West. It's very different from the North. We can be local right down to the point of our individual villages and communities within those villages. So, I think that local control is hugely important, and absolutely it comes down to more than where we are based physically. A little bit like Kate with the Highland Council being in Inverness. Aberdeenshire Council is based in Aberdeen, so some would say that's not ideal, myself included, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that, Louise. I'm starting to have thoughts back to my councillor days. So I was firstly a councillor for Mid-for-Martin. And as you say there, the west to east coast is very different. And part of the constituency, just in that council ward itself, I had Balmady, which was, a coastal community. But I also had inland, very, more rural farmer type communities. And it was very different between those two within a council ward. So how local do we actually get? We could bring it right down to streets, really, when we think about it. But what do you think reform could look like? Or can I ask you, what would you like reform to look like if you could have an idealized version? Kate, come to you.
Yeah, I think I start again, the Highlands I know best, and perhaps the Highlands encapsulates what Louise has just talked about of the variety. So take Inverness, it's essentially a city, and yet within Highland Council, which of course, as we often say, is the size of a small country, there are areas like, for example, the Small Isles, where it would take me personally an 8-hour return trip, really, in order to visit about 40 people on the Isle of Rum. And they deserve representation. So it's critical that they have a voice in the Scottish Parliament, but it's critical that their voice is not just drowned out in the Highland Council chamber, when actually there will inevitably be more representatives from a city of Inverness than there will be representing the Small Isles and so on. So I think for me, the first thing is the fact that we need to break up structurally big behemoths like Highland Council, I've said it before, so it hopefully won't surprise anyone that I'm saying it again, and go back to much smaller structural entities. So, for example, Lochaber, Skye, Rossshire, and I'm sure the same could maybe be done in Aberdeenshire as well. If you think that the Western Isles and Orkney and Shetland are much smaller, and yet they also have geographical distances to travel. So again, how do we ensure that at the smallest most local level, they have real power? And by real power, I mean the ability to raise funding, acquire funding, and the ability to make decisions about how it's spent. Because so often money says everything, and also power over land and buildings and so on to make decisions. But I think too, it's about a question of what are the biggest issues we're all talking about. So take, for example, climate change. We know that in order to tackle climate change and reach net zero, yes, we need national governments to be setting targets, but we actually need all of us to be part of it. And when there was all the debate about highly protected marine areas, for example, one of the arguments I was making is actually, let's give local communities the power for over conservation, because conservation might look different in different areas. And if there's the general overall targets that we're all trying to get to, actually give local communities the power. And that's happening already. There's an example in South Lochaber, Durer and Kintallen. It's called McCall. It's a conservation community group. And they're trying to do what HPMAs were trying to achieve, but it's grassroots, it's bottom up. So I guess what I'm trying to say is a structural question, but the structural question is actually all about communities having tangible, real power that makes a difference, not just to their own affairs, but actually contributes to what we're trying to do as a nation.
Absolutely. And I really agree with that in terms of empowering grassroots communities to be able to implement the things that actually need to be done. We do look at the national picture. Climate change is one of the biggest threats facing us. But in terms of how we implement measures, and the people on the ground in those communities know best how to do that. And it's mostly within their gift to be able to do that too, because they know how their land, their area, their communities work. And as you were saying, Kate, as well, down to tax raising powers, local communities and how their economies work very different from a 10-mile drive to a 10-mile drive. So it's given those people the empowerment to be able to raise the funds to make the changes and implement these things as they wish. I'm seeing we've got a comment here from John Paul Warlow. In terms of local issues, I was wondering, in terms of agriculture, how do we reduce our carbon footprint whilst making local public transport more affordable to use in terms of ferries? Well, ferries aren't my area of expertise in the northeast corner, but Kate, do you have an answer for John?
Well, I have a few ferries and they don't all run very smoothly. So it's certainly an issue that crops up a lot. I think there's a couple of issues in there, isn't there? First of all, in terms of agriculture. So a lot of my constituency is small holdings. It's crofting. And crofting goes right to the heart of this as an ideological issue as well, in terms of land reform and power over future. And there's an issue here because we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. So again, for those that are trying to transition when it comes to agriculture to perhaps greener ways of doing things, we absolutely need to work with them and ensure that we're not just imposing things that might make sense in Edinburgh but don't make sense in local areas. And you start by listening. So you start by speaking to people and understanding what might work. For example, in the north of Skye is unlikely to work in places like Malig. So I think first of all, agriculture is key. Agriculture and transport are key. If we don't solve agriculture and transport, then we're not getting to net zero. But you also need to ensure that you're not just eradicating the place of people because you're destroying jobs in the same course. So it starts with listening and working and ensuring that there are incentives, there's financial support, and so on. And then when it comes to transport, I think that is where central government does need to take a greater role, because if you're going to be investing in new ferries and new forms of transport, then you do need to be working collaboratively with national government. But again, listening is key, understanding people's modes of transport, and so on. Karen, I feel like I'm speaking a lot, but
No,
can I make one little
yeah,
point? Because I'd be really keen to hear Louise's view on this,
yeah.
because I talked about taxation. And I would love to hear Louise's view, because there's a real tension between the redistributive model within local government and empowering local communities to raise money.
Yeah.
What do I mean by that? Well, we've always had an approach, which is that we share funds so that those who contribute more share with those that might contribute less. But when it comes to empowering local communities more with raising taxation, that becomes a tension. So take the tourism levy.
Yeah.
There's some
Debated
parts
yesterday.
parts of my constituency that have huge numbers of tourists, and there's some parts that have none. So that means that if you ensure that the funding raised in a particular small area is kept there, then you erode the redistributive model that's inherent in local government finances. And I'm just curious as to whether Louise has had a view on that as a councillor, because I'm sure that that's sort of in your DNA when it comes to funding. It happens on a national level. So if in the heart of Edinburgh, there's more money raised by, for example, towards non-domestic rates by the big business, then there's areas that are perhaps less wealthy that get some of that funding.
Yeah. Okay. So there's lots going on in here. I know, and I've been making little notes as we go along, because
I was also wanting to throw in as well, Louise, the fact that looking to re-rail up to Ellen as well, so sustainable transport there too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I used to work up in Banffenbucken College back in the days before it was Nescall. So I've driven that road, well, thousands of times, as have many other people. And I think getting railed back as far as Ellen and then beyond is something I feel hugely strong about, because of all the opportunities. So Kate spoke about lots of different things in there, and so I'll sort of speak very briefly about that public transport. I mean, unfortunately, we lost a great deal of funding in the council with regards to local bus services. So just as Scottish Government were giving young people under 22 the opportunity for free bus travel, then many of our bus services were withdrawn, and that was really has been quite disastrous, because it has impacted those communities who are perhaps more remote, have less wealth, fewer cars, and fewer modes of transport. So transport, especially around these rural areas, and connectivity is hugely important. I would love to see the railway being reinstated, because I think not only would that support people to live in more rural areas, and for our young people to not have that brain drain effect of, they grow up, they go to school, they might go to college in the local area, but then to get to work, they have to move, because there simply isn't the connectivity in terms of public transport. And being young people, they may not afford, their first car for a time. So I think transport is hugely important. It's something we really need to turn to in order to then allow our rural areas to flourish. That we don't have that difficulty. When I worked with students, part of my role was, moving them on from college into employment, and it came time and again, there was no way they could get to a workplace anytime before 11:30, and then they had to leave again at 2 o'clock for the only bus home that day. So that is a real issue. In terms of agriculture, and this takes it down to that local level that we're speaking about here this evening. I think having that eye to local agriculture and our produce, and in terms of our carbon footprint, again in terms of promoting the use of local produce in our areas, taking that down to a local level would be hugely important. One of my roles in the council is I'm spokesperson for education and children's services for the opposition, and one of the things that comes to us very often from children and young people themselves is, why are we eating food that comes from far away? Why are we not using that local food? And the answer almost invariably is that in order to have that, balanced provision of food, which we all appreciate we need to have, we need to go out to bigger suppliers who aren't going to be adversely affected necessarily by local issues such as the weather, for example. However, it doesn't take away from the fact that, to my mind, we really should be looking more locally, and that's that's sustainability, that's it's jobs, it's employment, it's rurality again, and it's also to do with that carbon footprint. So that target that we have for reaching our carbon reduction is very important in there. And in terms of our, fishers and farmers are what we have here, certainly in the northeast. We have a wonderful coastline, and we still have that fishing industry, even if much of it gets shipped off to the continent. But we have that capacity. So I think again locally, it's very important that we always look to that. Yes, in terms of tax and fundraising, I was out at a coffee morning this morning in the local constituency, and had a great morning and lots of delicious home bakes. So that always is a bit of a lure for me. I'll go pretty much anywhere for a nice slice of cake, but that's another story. But it was amazing. So speaking to people in a village hall, their concerns ran from short-term lets. They're a small coastal village. And they are seeing many of their houses going out to short-term lets, and the houses that are empty essentially for the greater part of the year. They also spoke about pavement parking. It's a tiny village. It's a huge issue for them. So these are sort of those more national level issues. And then it comes right down to the village hall that we were sat in, and the need for the upkeep and maintenance of that. And interestingly, and I am getting to the tax point that Kate's put, but interestingly, one of the speaking with the community council and the chair, they come up against a brick wall time and time and time again when they have wonderful ideas. They are such a close-knit community. A lot of goodwill and a lot of effort will be put in there. But when it comes to sourcing funding, that's when it all falls apart, because that funding is managed perhaps too centrally, and they simply struggle to access it and have to jump through hoops backwards in order to get that, which would allow them to do so much more in their community.
Yeah.
So in terms of that local fundraising and local tax raising, that's definitely needs to come under the spotlight, to see how we can use that money to best effect. And it's not about leaving people behind, people who are less well off, but it certainly looks to how we can best use the funds that we have at our disposal. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. So what would your idealized kind of version of local government reform look like, Louise?
I know, and that's when I was thinking about this evening, and I made a few little notes, and then I thought, oh my goodness, we could, like all of these really important questions, it would take weeks and weeks and weeks to answer it fully. And I think what we need to do is actually throw open the doors, and ask people. We can ask ourselves, and we can navel gaze, and we will know some of the answers, but actually it's about the perception of our constituents and of people who live locally. And I think we do have to take everyone with us. Again, it's asking people what they want, and it's doing with them rather than to them. So we will have our ideas. I agree entirely with Kate. I think about taking things down to that much more local level, being able to have that autonomy and take those decisions in a much more timious manner. This is one of the huge bugbears, is that wheels of government, at all levels, grind awfully slowly, and people can say, yes, 3 years ago I brought this to the attention of so and so, and we're still talking about it. So I think that agility would be wonderful to have in there, but I think that would have cognizance of what it is that people want, what they're dissatisfied with now, what people would like to see changed.
I think it's really interesting, the points you brought up there in regards to our fishers and farmers that are integral parts of our rural and coastal communities. Myself and Kate sit on the Rural Affairs Committee in Parliament, and at the moment we're scrutinising the future agricultural bill. And that includes, how we're looking forward to a sustainable agricultural industry in Scotland, and how are we going to fund that, and what should be the priorities within that funding. And it's quite a huge responsibility, and there's a lot involved in that. But ultimately, when we go to farm visits and we have these discussions, we have the witnesses there, a lot of it is very localized and bespoke to each individual farm almost, issues and things that they would see as probably a priority than other areas. So it's quite a complex issue, but locality has came into this as well. And in terms of the fishing sector, that's something I'm hoping to do this year, is try and promote eating more locally caught fish, because we do export most of it and we import the fish that we eat. And in terms of food security, it's so much better if we were to eat that fish that was landed here. So maybe a bit of a change in taste and some recipes coming up this year might be something that'd be worth looking forward to. A word you used there, Louise, was perception. And I'd like to probably take the discussion segue into that and talk about people's perception of local authority, of councils. This is something, being a councillor and now being an MSP, that I see a varied response on, but oftentimes I see quite negative reactions to the council and what they're doing. And councils do a lot of fantastic good work. They've got a lot of work to be doing and getting on with. And often, sometimes I feel underappreciated. And because they're your first foot, you're there right in the firing line of the public when something goes wrong. And when people come to me as an MSP to say, you know, I have this issue with education or the roads, which is within the council's responsibility, and I have to go and talk to the council about that. Oftentimes people don't realise that that is within the council remit. And for me as an MSP, it's not really my place to go and then dictate to the local authority what they do. And I suppose it's people's perceptions of local authorities and what they actually are doing. We know that it's low turnout often for local authority elections. If people really knew exactly what powers the council did have already, do you think that would make a difference? Is there anything we can do to engage the public more in local democracy? Kate?
Yes, absolutely. I have this conversation probably on a daily basis with people who raise issues with me and don't realise that it rests with the council. And when I suggest to them that they go and speak to their councillors, they don't always know who they are, which is remarkable, because I think that the issues that people do get very exercised about are nearly always at a local authority level. So even take something today, I participated in a debate in the Scottish Parliament on education. And people forget that actually the delivery element of education is all at a local authority level. So if you've got sort of disputes around national policy, which obviously many people do, or funding and so on, but at the end of the day, the delivery is at a local authority level. And so I think there's a lack of understanding, for starters. There's a lack of appreciation. And then thirdly, and this may be a wee bit too controversial, but I think there is not enough democracy. Okay. So I used to always say that in Scotland, when it comes to the Scottish Parliament or the Scottish Government, if you're really annoyed by about something, you know where to target your ire, yeah? You know who, let's say, the First Minister is, you know who the Cabinet is. I bet you can't name the Permanent Secretary. But when it comes to a local authority, so often in some local authorities, power rests more with the chief executive than the leader. And in other local authorities, you've got really powerful leaders. And, you know, that's, I think, the challenge, that every local authority should have really visible, strong-minded leaders. Yeah. Who are democratically accountable for what they do. And in Highland Council, we've got a brilliant leader at the moment, fantastic, Raymond Bremner. And we've got some really good councillors leading the council. But it's come through periods where, for example, when there was independents in charge, it was perhaps less of a party feel, which maybe has some positives for some people, but actually means, I think, a less strong sort of coherent feel to it. And then the chief executive was a lot more visible and perhaps a lot more powerful. So I think there's a question there about democracy too. And that's also why I'm in favour of more power at local authority level without the Scottish Government interference, because then it means that ultimately councillors and the council administration should be accountable. If they do things which are popular and work well, they should be re-elected. If they don't, they shouldn't be, because that's the nature of democracy.
Yeah.
So I think it is a question of accountability and democracy, as well as visibility and understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Louise?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Again, harken back just because it was my most recent engagement this morning. People were astounded when I tried to list off some of the things that we do as a local authority.
Yes.
Really amazed, really amazed. Yeah. And all the work that goes on behind the scenes. And I will say that actually, when I stood for election, I didn't know everything that I was going to be involved in and responsible for. And I'm going to just put my neck on the line and say that I would say a lot of councillors find themselves in that same position. If that's a fair thing to say. Yes. Thank you for saving me, Karen. And it's really interesting what Kate was saying about, I mean, I think we're fortunate in Aberdeenshire. We have a very collegiate approach. People do tend to work well together. However, as is always the way, it depends on the caliber of the people who are elected. There are those who do not contribute. Those who sit quietly on the backbenches, even of our chamber, and those who don't step forward and don't make their voices heard, and who have perhaps been elected because they stood, and very little reason other than that. You're absolutely right, Kate. Lots of people don't know who their local councillors are. Sometimes that's because the local councillors don't engage in the way that they should with their communities. I hope that people know who I am. I can't get away from she's the one with the Irish accent, so that always earmarks me there. I can't escape. But I think a lot depends on the caliber of the leaders, whether that's leader of the council, whether that's chief executives, and their involvement and their connection with councillors and their willingness to come forward, and work with everybody, and absolutely across party as well. But I see another comment.
Yes. So we have a comment from Vicky Harper. Now, Vicky Harper was once upon a time councillor Vicky Harper and one of our colleagues at Aberdeenshire Council. And myself and Vicky sat on the Education Committee at Aberdeenshire Council together. And she makes a really crucial point, actually, that parties need to celebrate and engage their elected councillors in a similar way they do their MPs and MSPs. I think all parties are lacking in this area. And that's something that used to crop up quite a bit. And myself and Vicky have had conversations about this, and that is in terms of parity of esteem for local councillors and everything that they have to deal with. When I first became a councillor, as you pointed out there, Louise, I didn't quite know what I was really getting myself into. And it can be down to the individual, how many hours you do and how you work. And for a lot of people, maybe that is just turning up to committees and votes or a full council. But I really enjoyed the casework. I still do as an MSP. It's one of my most favourite parts of my job. So I used to love going out and visiting people and taking the pictures of the potholes and sending them to the officers, having that conversation with people and realising how much these things actually do impact, individuals. And sometimes people just wanted to go and show me things that were out and about in the community. And that kind of engagement was really important. But I found that maybe that wasn't celebrated enough, what councillors really do on the ground. And if we're going to talk about local government reform and giving more powers to local authorities, that includes the councillors having a bit more of a mantle of responsibility, and having that respect really should be going along with that for local councillors. So I definitely agree with what Vicky's saying there. Oftentimes we get the comments that councillors get so much money and there's all these backhand payments and things like that. I never saw one once, but I do remember when I was a local councillor, it's not a lot of money that you get paid. It really isn't. And I think if people really looked it up to see what councillors are getting, it isn't a lot, and they might be quite surprised, actually. And I used to say at the time, I was a single parent and I was studying with the Open University and I was a councillor at the same time. And I was actually entitled to top-up benefits and housing benefit and receipt of housing benefit from the very same council that I was a local councillor for on my local councillor wage. Now, if people want to get involved in local council, it is quite hard front-facing work a lot of the time. We really need to have not just parity of esteem, but I would say, and oftentimes controversial, I don't know why, but that salary should be increased to match the responsibility.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think with that, Karen, I mean, you've really hit on it there, and it is a discussion that we have. And I think again, part of the when people do take issue when we speak about salary, I think part of it is because most people, because it's fine, most people really don't understand what it all is that you're responsible for, and it's a huge responsibility. You know, yes, there are those community groups and things that we work with to improve the heating in a hall, but it's also planning issues, which is quasi
yes.
legal decisions that you're taking.
Mhm.
That's a huge responsibility. We speak about housing for new housing developments of 500 plus houses, and whether we're going to have a school in there and what facilities we're going to have for the community, and really try our best under sometimes quite difficult circumstances to make those decisions with the constraints that are upon us, but also to have the best possible outcome that we can achieve for the people that we represent. So I think that's very important.
Absolutely. And we have Councillor Rosa Zalia saying that most councillors do engage and work hard, but it's not a very well paid job and they are not empowered. And I think a lot of councillors do feel that. Kate, do you think that along with local government reform, there could be or should be reform in how councillors themselves are elected? That stretches into that democracy aspect you were discussing.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the questions about pay, and you're absolutely right. I don't think many people know how much councillors are paid.
Mm.
And perhaps even worse than that, they don't realise that it's designed as a part-time job.
Mhm.
And I'm still to meet a councillor that manages to squeeze their
Mhm.
huge workload into part-time. There's no way you can do it. So, I think that it's about the whole nature of the job, because the salary and the suggestion that that assumes that you're then working sort of part-time for the council and part-time for something else,
Mm.
I think is part of the problem when it comes to parity of esteem. And I think secondly, it completely fails to understand the gravity of the job. So Louise, you talked about the nature of the decisions that councillors are making. They're huge. And many councillors, represent a lot of people. They represent vast areas in rural Scotland. And I think the challenge is that then it attracts older, retired individuals that maybe don't need to balance it with another job. And so this is also about diversity of representation. So one hand, it's about parity of esteem. Secondly, it's about diversity of representation. And if we want, for example, young women, if we want other underrepresented groups to go into being councillors, you actually need to make it easier for them to live. If you can't live off a job, then you're unlikely to go for it. And I think we see that at each election when you're trying to attract people to stand for council. And it's the real determined individuals who are willing to, really bust a gut that go for it. Because many people look at it and just think, it's too hard. And so I think that you're right. It's all part of reform. It's about nature of representation and so on. And I know we're talking about local government, but I think you can't do local government reform without looking also at the other structures. So I just saw Highland Council putting out a press release this week saying, if you didn't manage to form a community council earlier in the late last year, then there's another opportunity, because a lot of community councils couldn't be formed for lack of volunteers. And that means there's more work falling on the local councillor that might otherwise be done by a community council. So I think it's about attracting everybody to want to serve in those roles and looking at why they're not serving just now.
And it's a good point to think about in terms of many hands like work. Oftentimes it's a lot of work landing on the same people all the time within local communities. But often think if people could know and understand the roles that are there, how much time it might take, and making things more accessible for greater representation, online, hybrid, those sorts of things, right down to those intricacies and technicalities, ensures that we've got that wider representation, but also the knowledge to be able to get involved and feel confident about getting involved. Um, Louise, we're talking about the perception of local government. How do you feel about getting that communicated across to the public, everything that you do within your job as a local councillor? When you sit in committee, obviously you feel that mantle of responsibility in terms of education across the whole of Aberdeenshire. What you say could have influence upon policy.
Yeah.
How can you manage to communicate that across people in Aberdeenshire and let them know that they vote councillors in to make these crucial and vital decisions?
Gosh, it's a really important question, Karen, and I would say it almost comes down to that individual interaction that I will have with families and with individuals who might approach me for help and support. That they will have more of an understanding of what it is that I can do, and sometimes on occasion, unfortunately, not do, to be able to help them when they come to me looking for support in different areas. So it's interesting that that's how we reach people on an individual level, and then through those community groups that is incumbent upon us to go and seek out and spend time with. A really difficult area, and this is something that it was another councillor did this, but they put on a social media post, and it was a trickle down of all the different things that the council's responsible for, and I suppose there from that councillors. Now, social media, as we know, can be a bear pit. Some people were amazed; they didn't realise that the council was responsible for checking that the swings in the park were still, safe for little people to use, down to the people who said that, here we go again. Why don't we all feel sorry for the councillors? Boo hoo, that kind of approach. So it's a very difficult balance because we want to tell people what we do.
Yeah.
But we need to do it in such a way. We're not looking for sympathy, but we're just trying to let people know what it is that we actually are responsible for. But we do feel the burden of it.
Yes, I'm sure you do.
And I did, just to jump in there, because I remember I did a piece of work about 4 or 5 years ago on foster care.
Okay.
And, Louise, talking about the variety of work that the council is responsible for, it's remarkable. They are responsible for everything from the welfare of the most vulnerable in society. I mean, it does not get more vulnerable than a small child, 2-year-old, a 3-year-old. And that rests with the council, and all the way through to my pothole needs filled. And, the weight of responsibility right the way through, and for our kids' education and so on. So I do think that, I don't know the most effective way of doing it, Louise, because as you say, you do a list and people think you're getting your wee violin out, and you're not. You're actually wanting people to recognise that when you go to the polls to vote for your councillors, it's massive. It's actually almost more, it's the most important election there is, arguably, in terms of impact on your day-to-day life.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in terms of that impacts on our day-to-day lives through local authorities, Kate, why do you think it's really important that we have this discussion on local government reform, particularly through a lens of rural, remote and coastal and island communities?
Yeah, well, a few things immediately. You said it yourself in the opening remarks. Reform is 30 years overdue. So there's the first argument. Secondly, Scotland has changed so much in those 30 years. Think about the addition of the Scottish Parliament representation there, devolution. And, I think for those that support independence, it's just in our DNA to think that power should rest as close to the people as possible. And in Scotland, that's just not the case. It's better than it might be elsewhere. but we still have a long way to go. The next reason is that if we don't have that whole scale discussion about reform, we keep getting into the smaller disputes over things like council tax. So I think I was the first finance secretary since the SNP came to power that removed all sort of control from central government over setting council tax. So a couple of years ago, we'd had the freeze and then it was limiting it to 3%. And I took off all the reins. Now the reins are theoretically back on and we're having another big discussion about who has the power. And, we're going to keep having these debates and discussions, I think, until we have a much more grown up, blunt and robust conversation about local government. And you see it also happening when it comes to the National Care Service. So what does that mean for local authorities? And there's some powers that should rest with local authorities that I think at the moment people have forgotten about, like economic development. And what responsibility do local authorities have in terms of prosperous, thriving local towns? So, Karen, we could use all these different examples. I think my point is we're debating all these small little examples because we are not having this big conversation about the nature of local government. But I think if we're going to have that conversation, you can't avoid the structural debate too. And maybe that's only relevant in Highland Council. I don't know. Louise and Karen, you can speak to your own areas. But I do think the structural goes in hand with those other issues.
Absolutely. And I think there is a perception that politics is very much centralised to Glasgow, Edinburgh areas. Up here when we're talking to members out and about, or even individuals that aren't members of our same party, just hearing the perception that people have that they don't feel that the Northeast is having has enough powers within itself to do particular things. And I think oftentimes it does, and I have to, show, well, we have the powers within local authority to do X, Y, and Z. But obviously that is overseen by the Scottish Government at Holyrood in Edinburgh. But the perception is there, regardless of what is actual and happening. There's a perception that the powers aren't spread out, across the whole of Scotland. So I think part of the reasoning behind this podcast as well is to perhaps highlight these good things too that is actually happening within our local areas. So Louise, could you tell us something good or positive that's happening that's very localized to Aberdeenshire, for example, in the Northeast?
Do you know, Karen, I will tell you the thing that's top of my list at the minute, because I'm absolutely love it, are foundation apprenticeships, which started fairly recently with a very small cohort of pupils at academy level, sort of dipping their toes into the real world of subject areas that they were interested in. Now, there was these foundation apprenticeships are available all across Scotland, but I have to say that Aberdeenshire is absolutely leading the way. And we have, I'm going to say it's 97% success rate. Students who take part in this pass the course, pass their assessment, and they are open and available to all young people at Academy. And they cover areas from, engineering to beauty therapy to teaching to absolutely all level of ambition. And we've actually now recently been recognised by Aberdeen University with our foundation apprenticeships, which can lead into a medical degree. So they are being seen at university level, the huge value in them. And I recently attended a day at Balmoral with some young people from Inverurie and Peterhead, and we were treated fantastically, and there were cookery demonstration with a Michelin starred chef who was cooking venison from the estate, and it was just planting the seeds in the minds of the young people. And while some of them didn't have the ambition to go into cooking, they were interested in hospitality. And we had a great catering company there with lots of young people also telling their stories and their experience, to just light that little touch paper of enthusiasm and to
Yes.
open people's eyes to the possibilities. And there were a couple of young guys there, and oh my goodness, they were enthralled by the demonstrations of what they were seeing. And
Mhm.
then they made their own venison burgers, and we had a barbecue out in the snow, before they all headed off on their bus. So, great things are happening, and we
Yeah.
should be really incredibly proud of all our young people and the team behind it who are so
Yes.
dedicated to taking people on. So, yeah, good things are happening in Aberdeenshire. I'm very, very pleased and proud to say.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's really good to hear about all
Mm,
these really positive things. And it shows, best practice of what can happen when powers are local,
mhm,
when you can have that bespoke to your area, you know what works, the transport links, the
yeah,
schools, and what the focus is in their local communities. All that weave together with people who, want to do something really good for their
yeah.
local communities brings something quite magical. And I think
Mm,
if we look in a few years' time to where these young people are going to be and going to head, that positive destinations is going to be it's going to be fantastic to see
mhm,
where they're heading. It's great stuff.
yeah, it's
Good to hear.
huge.
So we're getting to the end. Our time's just slowly starting to run out, but I would like to do a bit of a quick fire round. And if there's anything off of this that you'd like to delve a bit more into, then please feel free. So I'm going to list off just some public services. And when I say the name of a public service, if you say local or national, and whether you think the power should lie locally or nationally. So, first one is education.
Local.
I think that I think there's going to be some of them where it's going to have to be split.
Mm,
Yeah.
yes.
And I think that delivery and implementation needs to be local, without a shadow of a doubt.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Um,
I'm gonna throw in my caveat as well, because I was thinking about this again earlier, and there are those that are going to need that national level input, but then
yeah.
delivery, at that local level. But based on what I've just said about foundation apprenticeships, I'm
Yes.
afraid I'm going to go local on that one.
Absolutely. And,
Yeah.
and part of the reason I really want to ask that question as well is oftentimes I do get constituents raising issues in regards to local education.
Mm,
And when I explain to them that, this is a local government decision, they want the Scottish government to intervene
mhm.
and to change that. But this is where shouting about local democracy and local government elections comes into play, because if they don't like how something is delivered on the ground, they need to know that that's why it's vital to be out and voting during council elections.
Yeah.
Emergency services.
I think they should be national, but there
Okay.
needs to be local information. But I think, for example, your ambulance service, I think
Yeah.
should be national.
Yeah, I think this is again one of those that there needs to be, and this actually possibly demonstrates what's really missing is that connectivity,
Mm,
because we do need that national level. However, and lovely Aberdeenshire with all our lovely Doric accents and words, and Aberharder, which is called foggy
foggy.
locally, foggy. Um, you know, uh, so when people lose that local knowledge, that
Yeah.
that can prove really difficult. And I think we've probably all heard of instances where an ambulance was delayed by X number of hours because they
Yeah.
didn't know the local geography and all of these sorts of things. So I'm afraid it is one of those ones. But and so maybe that it's the connection that we need to have there between local
Yeah.
government and national level. So national policy, local implementation, perhaps might be a way of thinking of it.
Yeah.
I wonder if the big challenge here is empowerment. So
Mm,
empowerment is not,
Yes.
it's about teams on the ground. At the end of the day,
Mhm.
teams on the ground who can
Yeah.
actually respond.
Yeah. Healthcare.
National. But I mean, I will absolutely defend the sort of regional boards.
Hmm.
And so that's why I suppose it's, when you say local, it's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
healthcare obviously needs to be delivered locally, entirely locally.
Yeah.
But I don't think we need any more boards, for example, with the HR, finance capabilities and so on.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Louise?
Yeah, that's it. It's about it's really kind of cherry picking what we can have at a national level, which would enable then, you know, those at a more local level to implement, you know, all the services that they need to.
Mhm.
But if we have that, very often we have that, you know, strata within management that's just repeated ad infinitum when we really don't need it to. You know, we need much more accessibility to healthcare in our communities, and
Yeah.
that's hugely important. But yes, combination of and just even in terms of standards and equity of opportunity for good healthcare,
Yeah.
that might need to come from that national level implementation, and again then for that delivery on the ground to take place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're running out of time here, but I'm going to skip on to tax, because I think that's something that's been raised a few times.
Mm.
More local than it
More
is.
local.
But like everything that you've mentioned, there's it's not one answer, is it?
Yeah.
So for example, I think non-domestic rate setting should remain national. I think council tax should be entirely local.
Louise? Yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult when you speak about rates. Absolutely, Kate. It's another one that I get presented with quite often. You know that we have put the rates up too high. You know, the non-domestic rates. So again, there's that, you know, misunderstanding and that not that connection of how the rates are set. But yes, I think council tax at a local level. And again, that's there has to be that parity, doesn't there, whereby our perhaps smaller, more rural communities, who might not have the fundraising capabilities of the larger, you know, towns and cities,
Yeah.
aren't forgotten about in that. So again, it's that, you know, we need that balance in there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for this conversation this evening. I hope people enjoyed it. It's really been quite educational for myself as well, and it's given me lots of food for thought. I think there in the last quick fire round, so to speak, we could see that obviously there is still a place for national government, and it's not either or. It's about these different spheres of government coming together, not tiers, but spheres of government who complement each other, but also ensuring that people on the ground in local communities can have their voices heard and can have that empowerment to enact policy. And I think that's something I'll certainly take away from this evening. So thank you both so much. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Been really great. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah.